Naomi came to Seoul to forget her past. She lost a child once. It broke her. So when she became a nanny to Jiho, an 8-year-old with a violent father, she loved him like the child she couldn't save. But love made her reckless. When she witnessed a murder, she didn't stay silent. She ran, with his child, into darkness. And what happens next will make you believe that some mothers are worth dying for. Naomi Brooks had learned, over the course of 32 years, that running away worked best when you ran towards something, not merely away from something. Raw flight was obvious, desperate, easy to track. But a woman who had a purpose, a job, a visa, a reason to be in a particular place, became invisible. People with destinations blended into the architecture of the world. Seoul had been chosen partly for its distance and partly because the agency that placed her, International Childcare Solutions, had been desperately seeking English-speaking nannies for wealthy Korean families. The interview had been conducted via video call from a small apartment in Portland, Oregon, where Naomi had been spending her nights staring at walls and her days at a part-time position in a hospital's palliative care unit. She had been good at that work once, holding the hands of the dying, smoothing the foreheads of the frightened, speaking in the low, certain voice that promised things she did not believe would come to pass. But the work had hollowed her out. The Kang family's representative had been a woman named Park Ji-won, who spoke English with the crisp precision of someone educated abroad and carried herself with the particular bearing of someone accustomed to arranging other people's lives. She had asked the standard questions: experience with children, language skills, references, background checks. She had not asked why Naomi was leaving America, though her gaze had lingered on the thin explanation about seeking international experience long enough to suggest she suspected there was more. Perhaps Park Ji-won had seen enough people running from things to recognize the shape of it in another person. She had made no judgments. She had simply nodded, made a note, and said the position would be available in 3 weeks. 3 weeks had stretched out in Naomi's Portland apartment like a holding breath. She had packed carefully, not too much, nothing sentimental. She had given notice at the hospital with a letter of resignation that offered no details. She had let her lease lapse. She had, in small, deliberate steps, made it so there was nothing for her to return to. When the day came to board the plane, she felt less like she was leaving, and more like she was finally admitting she had already departed long before. Seoul had struck her first as overwhelming. Incheon Airport stretched out like a gleaming cathedral of chrome and glass, and the crowds moved with a fluidity that suggested they were following invisible currents only natives could perceive. The taxi ride into the city had been a blur of highway overpasses and apartments stacked impossibly high, their windows glowing like cells in an organism too vast for the eye to comprehend all at once. The Kang family's apartment occupied the 42nd floor of a building in Gangnam, Seoul's wealthy district, where money had rewritten the skyline into something that looked more like the future than like any city that had naturally evolved. The elevator that carried Naomi upward had smelled of expensive perfume and silence. Through its glass walls, she had watched the city shrink beneath her, growing smaller and more abstract, until it became merely a pattern of lights and geometry. The apartment itself had taken her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a painting, the view so sweeping that the illusion of standing at the center of the world was difficult to resist. The interior was a study in minimalism, whites and grays, furniture with clean lines and no excess decoration, art that was clearly chosen for investment value rather than comfort. A housekeeper arrived 3 days a week. A chef could be summoned for formal dinners. Everything in the space whispered of a life built on money, security, and the careful curation of detail. Yet the apartment also felt hollow in a way that spoke to loneliness. The master bedroom, which she glimpsed briefly during her orientation, contained a bed that looked as if it was rarely slept in. The formal dining room had a table long enough for 12, its surface pristine and untouched. In the kitchen, where Naomi would spend much of her time, there were appliances of such advanced engineering that she spent her first afternoon simply learning how to operate the espresso machine. Jiho's room was the only space that felt lived in. It occupied the corner of the apartment with the best light, and unlike the rest of the home, it held the chaotic richness of a child's actual life. Books were scattered across shelves with little regard for organization. A violin sat in one corner, next to a stack of sheet music held down by a stuffed animal. The bed was made, but not perfectly, as if someone, probably a housekeeper, had done their best with resistance. On the walls hung drawings, some framed by professionals, others simply taped up, a visual timeline of a boy learning to render the world around him. Naomi's room, in contrast, was sparse and clean. A guest room that had briefly been repurposed into servants' quarters. It contained a bed with expensive linens, a dresser, a window that looked out toward the eastern edge of the city. No character, no history. Exactly what she had wanted when she took this job. A place that was not home, that made no claim on her identity, where she could exist without the weight of continuity. She had not understood then how quickly the weight of continuity would find her anyway. Jiho arrived home from school 2 days after Naomi's arrival. He was 8 years old, with the serious, careful demeanor of a child who had learned early that emotions were currency to be spent sparingly in the presence of powerful people. He had his father's eyes, dark, intelligent, assessing, but his face still held the softness of childhood, the last lingering traces of a time before the world had taught him to be suspicious. He had entered the apartment through the private elevator in a uniform that marked him as a student at one of Seoul's most exclusive international schools, his backpack hanging off one narrow shoulder. The housekeeper had collected him, but Naomi, preparing dinner in the kitchen, had heard his voice first. Small, careful, asking in Korean if his father was home. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, he had simply observed her for a long moment. Naomi, accustomed to the discomfort of being visibly foreign in spaces where everyone else matched, had continued her work, giving him the space to process this new variable in his environment. "You are the new nanny?" he had asked finally in carefully pronounced English. "I am. My name is Naomi. What's yours?" "Jiho. Kang Jiho." He had said his full name the way children do when they are still learning the power of their own designation. "Are you from Korea?" "No, I'm from America." "Which part?" "A place called Oregon. It rains a lot there. Trees and rain." He had nodded, absorbing this information with the seriousness of an anthropologist. "My mother is gone," he had said suddenly, without preamble. "She left when I was small. Mrs. Park says she wanted a different life." Naomi had set down her knife carefully, unsure how to navigate this confession. She had not received any briefing about Jiho's mother, about family structure beyond the existence of his father. The agency had provided only basic information: the child's age, his school, his routines. Nothing about the architecture of his emotional life. "That sounds like it was difficult for you," she had said finally, settling on honesty rather than comfort. "It was," he had agreed. "But now maybe it will be less difficult because you are here." The statement had been made without expectation, simply offered as a fact. Yet something in it had cracked open a sealed place in Naomi's chest, a place she had carefully shut down in the months since the funeral, since the small white coffin, since she had understood that her capacity to protect the people she loved was less reliable than her heartbeat. In the weeks that followed, she had discovered that Jiho was exactly the kind of child that made protective love inevitable. He was quiet without being withdrawn, observant without being cold. He spoke to her in Korean when they were alone, correcting her gently when she struggled with grammar, slowing down to ensure she understood. He showed her his schoolwork with a hesitant pride, as if expecting criticism but hoping for acknowledgement. He had learned early to be self-sufficient. He knew how to prepare his own uniforms, how to manage his schedule, how to move through the apartment without disturbing its careful order. But he did so with the subtle sadness of a child who had learned independence too young. The first time he asked her to help him with his English homework, he had been visibly relieved when she responded with patience rather than impatience. When she prepared his favorite meal, a simple rice bowl with vegetables she learned to slice properly, he had looked at her with something that resembled wonder, as if he could not quite believe that someone might anticipate what he wanted before he asked for it. Naomi had found herself building small rituals around his day. She would have breakfast waiting in the morning, never the same thing twice, but always something she knew he liked. She would help him select his uniforms, teaching him the English words for colors and fabrics. She would read to him in the evenings, Korean children's books at first, then English ones with illustrations they could discuss together, analyzing the pictures and debating what the characters were thinking. He had begun, very gradually, to trust her. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. He lingered longer in the kitchen while she cooked. He started asking her questions about her life in America, about why she had come to Seoul, about whether she missed her family. She had answered these questions with careful honesty, neither volunteering too much, nor closing doors that might lead to deeper connection. His father remained a ghost in the apartment. Kang Doyeon arrived home perhaps 2 or 3 times a week, always late in the evening, always in expensive suits that looked as though they had been tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders and the implicit power in the way he moved. He would greet Jiho with stiff formality, asking about school in Korean, listening to the answer with the distant attention of a man whose mind was elsewhere. He would exchange brief pleasantries with Naomi, always in English, always polite, but never warm. Naomi had been instructed to keep the apartment quiet when he was home, to ensure Jiho was in bed by 9, to remain unobtrusive. The staff, the housekeeper, the chef when he was called, the drivers and bodyguards who rotated in and out of the building, all seemed to operate according to similar instructions. There was a choreography to the apartment when Doyen was present, a careful spacing of human bodies designed to avoid collisions or unnecessary interaction. Yet she had noticed things about him, small details that troubled her without her being able to articulate why. The way conversations would halt when he appeared, the way his phone seemed to demand constant attention, with incoming messages arriving at all hours. The people who visited him, men in dark suits, their faces grave, their eyes moving restlessly around rooms as if searching for exits, did not look like businessmen. They looked like men for whom violence was a familiar tool. There had been an evening when she had passed his office and glimpsed him through the partially open door. He had been standing in profile against the window, looking out at the city, and she had been struck by the isolation that seemed to emanate from him like heat. He had looked, in that moment, like a man imprisoned in his own empire. But these were observations she kept to herself. She was employed to care for his son, not to interpret his character. The agency had been explicit. Ask no questions about his business, maintain professional distance, focus on the child's welfare. In exchange, she received a salary that was more money than she had made in 6 months at the hospital, a room of her own, and an apartment address that would satisfy any future employer who asked for references. It was, in short, everything she had come to Seoul to find: safety, stability, and the privilege of invisibility. 3 months into her employment, Naomi had begun to feel almost settled. The city, initially overwhelming, had become a series of mapped-out routes: the apartment, Jiho's school, the market where she bought ingredients, the small park where she took him on weekends. Her Korean had improved from non-existent to functional. She had made a tentative friendship with another nanny, a Filipino woman named Rosa, whom she met sometimes for coffee after dropping the children at school. The apartment had started to feel less like a space she was occupying and more like a place she inhabited. She had rearranged her small room, bringing in plants from the market, hanging up prints she had found in a bookstore. She had, without quite meaning to, begun building a life. Jiho had blossomed under consistent care. His grades had improved. His teachers reported that he spoke more in class, participated in activities, seemed more confident in his English. He had stopped asking if she was going to leave, though she suspected this was not because he believed she would stay forever, but rather because he had learned not to ask about uncertainties he could not control. It was on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in September that everything fractured. The day had begun normally enough. Naomi had prepared Jiho's breakfast, rice and eggs and kimchi, which he had come to enjoy, and walked him to the private car that waited each morning to take him to school. She had spent the early afternoon preparing ingredients for dinner, listening to Korean language videos while she worked, building her understanding of the grammar she struggled with. Around 2 o'clock, she had received a message from the driver. Jiho's piano lesson was running 30 minutes late. Instead of returning directly to the apartment, could she meet them at Apgujeong Mall? He would wait with the car while she picked up the boy. Apgujeong was one of Seoul's most exclusive shopping districts, all marble facades and expensive boutiques, where a single item cost more than Naomi's monthly salary. The mall's underground parking garage was organized with the precision of a surgical theater, each space marked, each level numbered. The car pulled into a spot on the third level, and Naomi settled into the back seat to wait, scrolling through her phone to pass the time. The mall above bustled with the ordinary commerce of wealthy people with disposable income. Down here, in the concrete dimness of the garage, the world felt insulated, separate, quiet, except for the occasional distant echo of a car or footsteps. Naomi had checked the time. 2:47 p.m. The piano lesson would conclude at 3 o'clock. She should be back at the apartment by 3:30 to begin dinner preparation. The black SUV arrived without warning. It appeared at the far end of the row, tires squealing as it took the turn too fast, its movement sudden and aggressive in the stillness of the garage. Before Naomi could fully process what she was seeing, its doors flew open. 3 men emerged, moving with the coordinated purpose of people who had rehearsed this action, who knew exactly what they were doing. From the rear of the SUV, they dragged a 4th man. He was bound at the wrists with plastic restraints, his head hanging forward, his shirt already stained with blood that had begun to darken the fabric. When they forced him to move, his legs barely responded, as if consciousness was already abandoning him. Naomi's mind, conditioned by the orderly logic of everyday life, struggled to process what she was witnessing. The brain does not easily accept violence when it has been trained to expect banality. For several long seconds, she watched the scene as if it were playing out on a screen, something happening at a distance, something that belonged to the realm of fiction rather than reality. One of the men struck the bound man in the ribs, a casual blow designed to ensure cooperation rather than to express rage. The man crumpled further, his knees nearly giving way. They caught him, held him upright, dragged him toward a concrete support pillar that rose from the garage floor like the spine of the building itself. Only then did the full horror of the situation settle into Naomi's body. This was not a dispute between businessmen, this was not a robbery or a mugging. This was execution, clinical and practiced, the act of people for whom violence had become a professional skill. The bound man would not be leaving this garage alive. Naomi's hands moved of their own accord, pressing against her mouth to stifle a sound she did not realize she was making. Her breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. Every instinct screamed at her to do something, to call out, to honk the car horn, to somehow interrupt the momentum of violence unfolding before her. She could not move. Fear had transformed her into stone, into glass, into something that could witness but could not act. This was the particular helplessness of the bystander, the person whose presence changes nothing about the outcome but marks them forever as someone who saw. One of the men, the one who seemed to be directing the others, positioned himself in front of the bound man. From inside his jacket, he withdrew something dark and metallic. Even from her distance, Naomi recognized the shape of a gun, the way he held it with the casual familiarity of someone for whom a weapon was as natural as a pen. There was no speech, no grandstanding declaration, no moment for final words or pleas. The violence that was about to occur would be as efficiently executed as a medical procedure. The sound, when it came, was not as loud as Naomi might have expected. It was almost intimate in its dampness, swallowed by the close concrete walls and the surrounding cars. The bound man jerked, his body going rigid for a single horrible moment, and then he fell. The gunman stepped back, assessed the prone figure with the analytical gaze of someone checking off a completed task, and then looked up. His eyes, moving across the rows of parked vehicles, found the car where Naomi sat. For a fraction of a second, their gazes met across the expanse of the garage. Naomi saw in that moment that he was perhaps 40, with the kind of face that was neither distinctive nor forgettable, the sort of man who could disappear into a crowd with ease. But his eyes held the flat, empty quality of someone whose humanity had been carefully excised, leaving only the instrument that performed violence without hesitation or remorse. He did not shout. He did not break into a run. He simply held her gaze for a beat too long, long enough for her to understand that he had seen her, that he would remember her, that this moment had inscribed itself into his consciousness just as it had into hers. Then he turned back to his companions. They gathered the body, or what remained of it, and began moving it back toward the SUV. The vehicle's engine started. Tires squealed again as it pulled out of its space and accelerated toward the exit. Within 90 seconds, it had vanished, leaving only the echo of its engine and a single dark stain spreading across the concrete floor. Naomi did not move for a long time. Her body had locked in response to the trauma, every muscle tensed against motion. Her breathing remained shallow, her vision narrowed to a tunnel that contained only the spreading stain and the profound emptiness of the garage. Time had become meaningless. She could not have said whether 5 minutes or 50 had passed. When movement returned to her limbs, it came in a tremor, a violent shaking that began in her hands and spread upward through her arms into her shoulders. She realized she was making a sound, a low, keening noise of distress that she could not control and was not entirely aware she was making. It was the arrival of the driver and Jiho that pulled her back into functional reality. The driver appeared first, arriving with the boy in tow, Jiho's backpack slung over one shoulder, his piano case in his other hand. The driver was a man in his 50s named Kim, who had been with the Kang family for many years and maintained the professional neutrality that all the household staff cultivated. He helped Jiho into the car, closed the door, and only then seemed to notice Naomi's state. His expression shifted immediately, a flicker of concern, quickly masked. "Are you well, Ms. Naomi?" he asked in careful English. "Yes, yes," she managed, forcing her voice to function. "Just feeling a little dizzy. The heat of the garage, perhaps." Kim nodded, accepting the explanation without comment. He did not ask why the car had not been running with the air conditioning on, why the windows were closed despite the warmth. He simply returned to the driver's seat, started the engine, and began the careful navigation out of the garage and back toward the street. Beside her in the back seat, Jiho was chattering about his lesson, how he had managed a difficult passage, how his teacher had been pleased, how he wanted to learn a new piece next. The normalcy of his voice, the absolute obliviousness to the violence that had just been committed meters away, struck Naomi with almost physical force. She looked at his small face, his evident pleasure in his modest accomplishment, and something broke open in her chest. She reached over and pulled him close, surprising both him and herself. He stiffened briefly. Jiho was not accustomed to sudden physical affection, and then relaxed into her embrace, his small body fitting against hers with a trust that made the terror in her stomach intensify. He was safe. He was alive. He was untouched by the darkness that had just swept through the garage and vanished as quickly as smoke. But how long could that remain true? That night, Naomi lay in her room, unable to sleep. The moment she closed her eyes, she saw the bound man's collapse, the spreading stain on concrete, the gunman's empty gaze finding hers. The memory played over and over, a video she could not stop, could not pause, could not rewind to before the moment it showed. Around midnight, she rose and opened her laptop, hands shaking as she navigated to Korean news sites. Her language skills were not sufficient to read with full comprehension, but images and headlines told enough of the story. A businessman had been found dead in Gangnam, suspected organized crime. No arrests yet. No suspects identified. The victim's face appeared in one photo, older than the bound man in the garage, but she could not be entirely certain. The images were low resolution, the lighting poor. Yet something in her knew she had just watched a man die, and that death would be reduced to a headline, a statistic, a brief mention in the endless scroll of human misfortune. She did not go to the police. Even in her shocked, terrified state, she understood the calculus of doing so. She was a foreigner, an employee of the family in whose district the crime had occurred, a woman whose presence would be difficult to explain and easy to dismiss. Who would take her seriously? And more practically, what would the police do with a report from someone who could barely describe the vehicles and could not identify the gunman with any certainty? Instead, she became obsessed with learning who Kang Doyan really was. She researched carefully, using the apartment's Wi-Fi but clearing her browser history after each session, terrified of leaving traces. What she found was a carefully curated web presence, legitimate business holdings, real estate investments, philanthropic contributions to hospitals and schools. The Kang name appeared in business journals and luxury magazines, always in connection with success and growth. But beneath that surface, other information existed in fragments and implications. Reddit threads discussing Korean organized crime mentioned the Kang family. A website documenting missing persons from Seoul included a note about organized trafficking possibly connected to the Kang organization. News archives from 5 years prior mentioned investigations that had mysteriously stalled, witnesses who had disappeared, prosecutors who had retired or moved to different cases. The picture that emerged was not definitive. It was impossible to confirm, but it was terrifying nonetheless. Kang Doyan, it appeared, was not simply a wealthy businessman. He was, in all likelihood, the leader of a major organized crime family. And Naomi, ordinary, unremarkable, foreign Naomi, had witnessed a murder committed by his organization. The realization transformed her daily existence into something suffused with dread. She began to notice things she had previously overlooked. The cameras in the apartment, ostensibly for security purposes. The men who appeared periodically in the building's hallway. Their presence never explained. Their purpose unclear. The way conversations would cease when she entered a room, as if the staff had been discussing something that was not meant for her ears. She watched Doyan with new eyes when he came home, trying to see the crime boss beneath the expensive suit. Was there a difference in his demeanor? Something in his gaze that suggested he was aware of her knowledge? Sometimes she thought she caught him watching her, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes calculating. Other times, he seemed to look through her entirely, her existence too insignificant to register. A week after the parking garage, she received a text from an unknown number. The message was in Korean, deliberately simple. You saw what you should not have. Think about what that means. Her hands shook as she deleted the message, though she understood with perfect clarity that deletion meant nothing. The threat had been delivered. The knowledge of her knowledge had been communicated. Someone in Doyen's organization knew she had witnessed the murder. More terrifying still, they knew how to reach her. That night, she crept into Jiho's room after he was asleep. She stood in the darkness, watching his small chest rise and fall, feeling the weight of the situation settle on her like a stone. If they wanted to eliminate her, they would. But they also knew she had been with Jiho, which meant any action against her could implicate them in child endangerment, or worse. Perhaps that was what kept her alive. Not mercy, but the acknowledgement that her death could create complications. Or perhaps they were simply waiting, watching, evaluating. Perhaps they wanted to know what she would do, whether she would go to the police, whether she could be managed through fear alone. Naomi understood, in that dark room with a sleeping child, that her window of safety was closing. However long it lasted, it would not be indefinite. At some point, Doyen or his lieutenants would decide that eliminating the witness was more necessary than leaving her alive. And when that decision came, when the machinery of their violence turned toward her, she would have only one option: to run. But she could not run and leave Jiho behind. The choice crystallized in her mind with perfect, terrible clarity. She would have to take him with her. She would have to become, in the eyes of the law and the media, and probably Doyen himself, a kidnapper. She would have to steal this child from his father, from his school, from the life he knew. She would have to become a criminal in order to save a life. The logic was inescapable, but the timing remained uncertain. She could not run yet, because running would confirm suspicions and accelerate the timeline of her own death. She needed to gather resources, to plan escape routes, to move with enough caution that Doyen and his organization would not recognize the preparations as anything other than normal household activities. She needed, in short, to become a spy in her own life, to perform her role as nanny while simultaneously building the infrastructure of escape. So she began, very carefully, to steal small amounts of cash from the household accounts, so small as to be unnoticeable in the context of hundreds of thousands passing through the family's finances each month. She opened a bank account under a name only slightly different from her own, depositing these small sums into a savings account that would eventually become her escape fund. She researched transportation, which train stations required the least identification, which bus lines ran late at night, which cities were large enough to hide in. She gathered documents, her passport, her vaccination records, everything that might be necessary for leaving the country or moving within it. She made copies of Jiho's vaccination records and school documents, understanding that she might need these if she was going to justify his absence from school. All of this she did while maintaining the careful facade of normalcy. She continued to pack Jiho's lunches, to help him with his homework, to read to him before bed. She continued to greet Doyen with professional courtesy when he was home, to defer to his preferences, to make herself small and unobtrusive in the way she had been trained. But beneath the surface, she was preparing for war against a man whose power was far greater than her own. 2 weeks after the parking garage, another delivery arrived at the apartment. It was a package, wrapped in elegant paper, with no sender identification. The housekeeper accepted it and brought it to Naomi, noting that it was addressed to her personally. Inside was a watch. It was beautiful and expensive, clearly a luxury brand, the kind of thing she would never have purchased for herself. There was no note, no explanation. But there was a message nonetheless. They knew where she lived. They could reach her whenever they chose, and they were capable of gestures that ranged from intimidation to apparent kindness with equal ease. That night, unable to sleep, Naomi opened the watch's back. Inside, beneath the mechanism, was a photograph. It showed her and Jiho in her bedroom. They were both asleep, her arm around him, his small hand clutching her shirt. The photograph had been taken from inside the room, from very close by. Someone had come into her room while she slept. Someone had stood over them both and captured an image that was simultaneously intimate and terrifying. The violation of it, the intrusion into the one space she had believed was hers, shattered something inside her. She pulled Jiho closer that night, his small body pressed against hers, and made a silent promise. They would not have him. Whatever it cost, whatever she had to do, she would not let these men, these people capable of violence and intrusion, shape his future or claim his life. The escape, she decided, would happen soon, within days, if possible. Before they could construct a cage any tighter, before she lost her nerve, before circumstances changed in ways she could not predict, before it was too late. The morning arrived gray and cold, autumn settling over Seoul with a weight that made even the wealthy apartment feel less like sanctuary and more like a trap. Naomi had not slept in 3 days, running on adrenaline and the terrible clarity that comes from knowing you have crossed some invisible line from which there is no return. She had received 2 more messages from the unknown number. The first, reconsider your options. The second, the boy is so lovely. It would be a shame if anything happened to him. The threats had stopped being implicit. They were now direct, specific, calibrated to maximize terror. That morning, while Jiho was in school, and the apartment was quiet except for the housekeeper in the distant kitchen, Naomi did something she had been planning for weeks. She called the number that had been texting her. The man who answered spoke in Korean, his voice carrying the measured quality of someone used to conducting dangerous conversations. Naomi's Korean was not sophisticated enough for complex negotiation, but she managed. I want to know what you want from me, she said in careful, halting Korean. There was a pause. Then, you know what you should not know. You have a choice. Keep silent or disappear. And if I keep silent, then you and the boy live. You are valuable to Mr. Kang because of the boy. That is the only thing keeping you alive. The subtext was clear. They would use Jiho as leverage to ensure her compliance, or they would kill her and take him. The uncertainty of which was precisely calculated to maximize her compliance. I need time, she said. You have 3 days. After that, the situation will be resolved. The line went dead. 3 days. The number had precision to it, an ultimatum that was also a clock. In 72 hours, if she had not done what they wanted, which was to remain silent, invisible, containable, they would move against her. And in moving against her, they might also move against Jiho, unless she moved first. That afternoon, while waiting for Jiho's piano lesson to end, she withdrew a large portion of cash from an ATM, converting her stolen funds into currency that could be used anywhere. She purchased new phones from a convenience store, paying in cash. She bought a small backpack from a sporting goods store, packing it with changes of clothes, documentation, and the book with Jiho's school records. She was committing to it now. There was no turning back. When she picked Jiho up from school that day, she noticed the driver seemed unusually tense, watching her in the rearview mirror with more attention than usual. Had they already begun tightening their surveillance? Did they suspect she was about to run? Jiho, she said carefully as the car navigated Seoul's traffic. How would you feel about taking a trip? A trip? He looked up from the book he had been reading. With my father? No. With me. Just us. Something flickered across his face. Fear, hope, confusion. Where would we go? Somewhere safe, she said, and it was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in a very long time. He did not ask more questions. Children understand intuitively when adults are making important decisions, when the normal rules have been suspended. He simply nodded and returned to his book, though she noticed he read the same page multiple times without progressing. That evening, Naomi had dinner prepared as usual. Doyen was not home. He was rarely home on weekdays, always off managing the empire that supported this apartment and this life. At 8 o'clock, she bathed Jiho, dressed him in warm clothes, and told him they needed to go out for a little while. Right now? He asked, surprise evident in his small voice. Right now. She packed his backpack with essentials: his passport, his insurance card, his favorite stuffed animal, a change of clothes. She left a note on the kitchen counter for the housekeeper, claiming she was taking him for an emergency medical appointment and would return late. It was a lie that would buy her a few hours, no more. The escape began at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, with a child in hand and fear like ice water in her veins. The taxi driver barely glanced at them as they climbed into the back seat. Naomi gave the address of Seoul Station and said nothing else, watching the city streets flow past the windows. Each turn of the vehicle, each red light, each moment they remained within Seoul felt like a tactical error. They were still too close to the apartment, too close to the men who would certainly be looking for them by morning. Seoul Station loomed ahead, a massive structure that served as a hub for multiple forms of transportation. Naomi purchased tickets to Busan on a late train, paying in cash, using her real name but knowing it was the name they were searching for anyway. Anonymity was impossible. Speed was all that remained. They boarded the train at 11:14 p.m. Jiho dozed against her shoulder almost immediately, exhausted by the strangeness of the day, his small body trusting despite the chaos around them. Naomi did not sleep. She watched the passengers boarding and disembarking at each stop, terrified of seeing faces that matched her nightmare, men in dark suits, moving with predatory purpose. The train carried them south through the darkness. Busan was different from Seoul. It was older, rougher, a city built around the harbor rather than reaching endlessly upward. The beach and port gave it a sense of being outside of the interior power structures, a place where money from organized crime might be less consolidated, where multiple power centers competed for dominance. Naomi did not go directly to a hotel. Instead, she moved through the city in small steps, changing directions frequently, riding buses at random, doing everything she could to ensure she was not being tracked. She paid cash everywhere. She avoided convenience stores where credit card transactions could be traced. She moved like a person hunted, because that was exactly what she was. By the second day in Busan, paranoia had become her constant companion. Every man in dark clothes was a potential killer. Every phone call in the apartment next door could be someone coordinating her capture. She barely slept. She barely ate. She focused all her attention on keeping Jiho alive and keeping them moving. The news appeared on the third day. A story about a missing child, Kang Jiho, 8 years old, missing since Tuesday night along with his American nanny, who was suspected of kidnapping. The story included photographs. Naomi's face was pixelated, a precaution supposedly for the child's privacy, but the effect was to make her look criminal, suspicious, dangerous. The narrative was already written. The nanny had abducted the child, presumably for ransom or revenge. The police were investigating. Anyone with information was encouraged to come forward. There was no mention of the murder Naomi had witnessed. There was no context that might complicate the story or suggest that her flight had any justification. She had become, in the public consciousness, a criminal. The realization brought a strange clarity. The police could not help her. Going to them would be walking into Doyen's hands. She had no one to turn to, no ally, No one who could shelter them without putting themselves in danger. All she had was herself, a frightened 8-year-old boy, and the will to survive. It was on the fourth day that Detective Lee Min-sok found them. She had taken Jiho to a small coffee shop in a residential neighborhood, thinking they would be less visible in the daytime, surrounded by ordinary people engaged in ordinary activities. She was nursing a coffee and helping Jiho with a simple workbook when a man in his mid-30s entered and sat several tables away. He was not in a suit. He wore casual clothes and carried no obvious threat. But something in his bearing, in the way his eyes moved across the room and then settled on her, with a deliberateness that suggested calculation rather than accident, made her tense. He ordered coffee and waited until the barista had moved away before speaking. When he did, he spoke in careful English. "Naomi Brooks?" Every muscle in her body locked. "My name is Detective Lee Min-sok. I'm not here to arrest you." He said this quietly, without moving from his seat, as if understanding that sudden movement might cause her to bolt. "I'm here to help. How did you find me?" Her voice came out as a whisper. "I've been investigating the Kang family for 4 years. When you disappeared with the boy, it became clear to me that you had witnessed something. Something that made you run." He paused, allowing that information to settle. "I saw the security footage from the mall parking garage. I know what you saw." Naomi's hands were shaking so badly that she had to grip the edge of the Shora table. "If you found us, they'll find us too." "Maybe. But I found you first, and I'm willing to bet I'm the only one who knows you're in Busan." He leaned forward slightly. "You can't run forever. You don't have the resources, the connections, or the knowledge of how to disappear permanently. But you might have something better than that. Evidence. The kind of evidence that can take down Doyen and his entire organization." "I won't testify." Naomi's voice was firm. "Not if it puts him in danger." She gestured to Jiho, who was watching them with the intensity of a child who knew something important was happening. "I understand that, which is why I'm not asking you to testify yet. I'm asking you to come with me to a safe house. To tell me what you saw. To let me do the work of building a case that will protect him." "How do I know you're really a detective? How do I know this isn't a trap?" Min-sok reached into his pocket slowly, removed his badge, and placed it on the table where she could see it without having to move. "You don't," he said simply. "You just have to make a choice. Keep running, which gives them time to find you and eliminate the problem. Or trust me, which might save you both." The choice was between two kinds of impossible, but one of them offered a sliver of hope. Naomi nodded slowly. "Okay." The safe house was in a quiet residential neighborhood in Daejeon, a city between Seoul and Busan that was large enough to provide anonymity without being so massive as to draw attention. It was an apartment like 10,000 others in a building like 10,000 others. Unremarkable, anonymous, impossible to notice. Min-sok had brought them there in an unmarked vehicle, taking a circuitous route that was designed to shake any possible surveillance. The apartment contained basic furniture, a kitchen, bedrooms, a bathroom. It was not comfortable, but it was secure, and that was all that mattered. "You'll stay here," Min-sok said, handing her keys. "Someone will bring groceries 3 times a week. If you need anything, you call this number." He provided a burner phone. "Never, ever use your own phone. Never access social media. Don't go outside except at night and only when necessary. Understood?" "Yes," Naomi said. "I'll need you to tell me everything. Every detail you remember. Every word they said. Every feature you could describe. Everything that might help me build a case." For the next 8 hours, Naomi recounted the parking garage. She described the men, the bound man's appearance, the gun, the gunshot, the spreading blood. She described the moment their eyes had met, and the knowledge in them that she would be remembered, that she would eventually become a liability. Min-seok took notes, asked careful follow-up questions, built a framework around her testimony that would, he hoped, be sufficient to begin an investigation. "There's something else," he said as the sun was beginning to set. "I need physical evidence. Your testimony will help, but not enough. The Kang family has enough money to make even a clear case murky. I need something that directly connects Doyen to the murder. Something that can't be explained away. I don't have anything. But you know where things might be. The apartment? His office. There has to be somewhere he keeps records." Naomi thought back to the office she had glimpsed only briefly, to the men coming and going with documents, to the sense she had had of secrets compartmentalized and protected. "There's a safe," she said slowly, "in his office, behind a painting. I saw him open it once. He didn't know I was there." Min-seok's expression shifted, a flicker of something. Hope, calculation, determination. "A safe with what inside?" "I don't know. Documents, maybe, or records of some kind." "Then that's where we need to look." For 3 weeks, Naomi and Jiho remained in the safe house while Min-seok moved through the world with the grinding persistence of a man who had dedicated years to a case most people assumed was unwinnable. He obtained warrants, difficult ones, requiring judge approvals that seemed to hang in limbo, but never enough to search the Kang apartment directly. The family's lawyers and their connections made obtaining a warrant for the personal residence nearly impossible. Instead, he pursued other angles. He interviewed people who worked at the building. He tracked visitors. He built a timeline. He accumulated enough circumstantial evidence to keep the investigation alive, but not enough to bring charges. Jiho, in the meantime, was deteriorating emotionally. The first week in the safe house, he had been compliant, understanding in a child's basic way that something was wrong and they needed to be hidden. But as the days stretched into weeks, the weight of confinement began to show. He had been removed from school without explanation, separated from his routine, confined to an apartment he did not understand. He asked, increasingly, about his father, about whether this was permanent, about whether he had done something wrong. "No," Naomi told him again and again, holding him close. "You didn't do anything wrong. Your father did something that made us unsafe. I'm protecting you." "Will you always protect me?" he asked one night, his voice small in the darkness. "Yes," she promised, knowing even as she said it that promises were fragile, that safety was temporary, that she was making a commitment she might not be able to keep. The case against Doyen began to accelerate in the 4th week. Min-seok called her with news that had her hands shaking. "I have a source inside the organization, someone who's decided they want out. They're willing to testify about 5 separate murders they witnessed. More importantly, they're willing to tell me about the safe." "What's in it?" Naomi asked. "Everything. Doyen's been documenting his father's organization for years, gathering evidence. Apparently, he wanted a way out. A way to ensure that his son would never be pulled into the family business. He was building a case against his own father and then against his own organization. Why would he do that? Because he became a father. Because he realized what he was and decided he didn't want his son to inherit it." Min-seok paused. "We're going to get that safe, Naomi. We're going to have irrefutable evidence, and then this will be over." But first, there was the matter of the safe. Without a warrant, Min-seok could not legally retrieve it. But Min-seok, tired of procedure failing him, had made a decision about what he was willing to do. With assistance from an internal affairs officer he trusted, he planned to break into the Kang office after hours and retrieve the contents of the safe. It was technically illegal. It was also the only way forward. He explained it to Naomi with the careful precision of a man asking her to be complicit in a crime. "If anything goes wrong, you did not know about this," he said. "I came to you. I asked for what you knew about the safe. I then took independent action. You are not responsible for my choices. What if you get caught? She asked. Then I'll face consequences. But the evidence will already be in circulation, which means it will matter even if I do. She understood then that Min-seok was willing to sacrifice his career, his freedom even, to bring down Do-yoon. He had become obsessed with the case the way certain people become obsessed with rectifying injustice. He was operating on principle rather than procedure, on the belief that the law should serve justice even when justice required breaking laws. The break-in happened at 3 a.m. on a Thursday night. Naomi waited in the safe house, watching the time crawl forward on her phone, imagining everything that could go wrong. Jiho slept in the room beside hers, unaware of what was happening in Seoul, unaware that the resolution of their situation was being determined in darkness and danger. When Min-seok arrived back at the safe house, it was 6 a.m., and light was beginning to break across the city. He looked exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. He was carrying a small black case. "We have it," he said simply. "Everything we need." The case contained documents, records of transactions, lists of names, photographs of meetings and operations. It contained evidence of murders, of trafficking, of corruption spread across years and different administrations. It contained the complete anatomy of an organized crime family, laid bare in the meticulous documentation of a man who had been planning to use it to dismantle his own empire. More than that, it contained evidence that connected Kang Do-yeon directly to the murder Naomi had witnessed: names, dates, payments made to the executors of the killing. The case was no longer circumstantial. It was definitive. "This is enough," Min-seok said. "More than enough. We can begin prosecution within days." The trial became a media sensation. A wealthy businessman, heir to an empire, revealed as the leader of an organized crime family that had operated with impunity for years. The newspapers ran stories about the American nanny who had witnessed a murder and chosen to protect a child rather than her own safety. The television coverage was intense, sensational, the trial treated like theater rather than the serious business of justice. Naomi testified for 3 days, her voice steady despite her fear. She recounted the parking garage, the murder, the messages, the photograph taken while she slept. She described fleeing with Jiho, hiding, waiting. She described what she had seen in the safe and how Min-seok had obtained it. The defense attorney was vicious, painting her as a desperate woman seeking attention, a foreigner who misunderstood Korean business customs, an unstable individual prone to exaggeration and lies. He questioned every detail and suggested alternative interpretations that would be benign if believed. But the evidence was overwhelming. It corroborated her testimony. It expanded far beyond her specific observation to encompass years of criminal activity. By the time the prosecution rested their case, the jury's verdict seemed almost inevitable: guilty on all major counts. The judge sentenced Kang Do-yeon to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. In the courtroom, as the verdict was read, Do-yeon showed no reaction. But his eyes found Naomi's for a single moment, and she saw something in them that surprised her: gratitude. He had wanted this. He had orchestrated his own destruction because the alternative, passing his empire to his son, was unbearable. 2 years later, Naomi stood in the immigration office of a Canadian province and accepted guardianship papers for Jiho Kang, who was now legally a minor in her care. She had used the testimony that prosecutors offered to those in danger. Witness protection had relocated her, given her new names, new documentation, a new life in a new country. She had used the opportunity to establish permanent legal status as Jiho's guardian, to begin the process of normalcy that might eventually feel less like performance and more like reality. Jiho was now 10 years old. He had been enrolled in school, placed in a program for children with language barriers, connected to other kids his age. He was beginning to smile more frequently. The trauma of the flight and the confinement was slowly being overlaid with the process of building a life. He did not know, yet, the full story of his father. He knew that Kang Doyan was in prison, that he had committed crimes, that Naomi had been forced to remove him from danger. In his mind, his father had become a figure both present and absent, defined by the absence that had restructured his entire world. "Will you tell me?" he asked one night as Naomi read to him before sleep. "Why my father did bad things?" Naomi thought carefully before answering. She was learning that honesty and protection were not always compatible, that sometimes loving someone meant withholding complete truth until they were old enough to understand its weight. "Your father was born into a family that expected certain things from him," she said. "He became those things for a long time. But then he became a father, and he realized he didn't want you to become those things too. So he changed. Not in time to undo everything, but in time to save you." "Did he love me?" Jiho asked. "Yes," Naomi said, and she believed it was true. "Very much. So much that he gave up everything he had built to make sure you could be free." Jiho nodded slowly, absorbing this explanation. "I'm glad I have you," he said finally. "I'm glad I have you too," Naomi replied, and meant it with a depth of feeling that surprised her with its intensity. 5 years after the trial, Naomi stood in a park in Vancouver, watching Jiho, now a teenager of 13, tall and thoughtful and impossibly kind, play soccer with friends his own age. His life was ordinary, the kind of life she had run toward and fought for. He attended a regular school, had regular friends, engaged in regular activities. To anyone looking at him, he was simply a Korean-Canadian boy, no different from thousands of others in the city. She wore a jacket against the autumn chill, watching from a bench as he chased the ball, his face lit with concentration and effort. He did not see her, and that was fine. She was background now, foundation, the structure that held his life up without needing to be center stage. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number, routed through a secure app. Detective Minsok. His messages came rarely, always carefully encrypted, always concerned with her well-being and Jiho's progress. "Doyan died in prison," the message read. "Heart attack, quiet." He left a letter. Requested I tell you he was grateful, that he hoped his son would have the life he never did. Naomi sat with that information for a long time, watching Jiho celebrate a goal his team had scored. Doyan was dead. The man who had set all of this in motion, who had orchestrated his own downfall in service to protecting his child, was gone. It should have felt like closure, but instead, it felt like completion. Not the ending of something, but the full realization of something that had always been inevitable. Doyan had set out to save his son by destroying his own empire. He had succeeded, and in succeeding, he had ensured that a black woman from Portland, Oregon, and a Korean boy born into violence could build a life that was quiet and ordinary and finally, miraculously, safe. As Jiho ran toward her at the end of the game, his face flushed from exertion and joy. Naomi understood something she had not known when she first took this job in Seoul. That love was not about origin or obligation or biological connection. It was about choosing day after day to protect someone's future. It was about standing between them and darkness. It was about sacrifice and survival and the fierce, unshakable determination to ensure that they had what had been stolen from you. She opened her arms as he crashed into her, breathless and laughing, and she held him like she would never let go. Because in all the ways that truly mattered, she never would.